It bit into every seam of Belgium's Ardennes forest, into the soaked wool of greatcoats in the foxholes, into numb knuckles, and deep into the hands of Lane Carter, hands that would not stop shaking. The tremor had something to do with the temperature, but it came more from somewhere else, from the artillery barrage a week earlier that had flipped his whole body over and then buried him in the mud. The barrage was past, but the roar seemed to have stayed behind inside his ears, turned into an unending shriek. Worse were his hands. They no longer obeyed. Even when he tried to do something as simple as holding a broom to sweep mud off the floor of regimental headquarters, an improved cellar beneath a Belgian farmhouse, his grip would stutter and jerk, flinging clots of muck onto the boots of officers passing by. So more often he crouched in a corner, staring at the hands that had betrayed him, forcing them between his knees as if he could hide the damned proof that he was useless. They had labelled him combat stress reaction, a gentler phrase. Most men just called it shell shock. The surgeon had looked him over, shaken his head, written a prescription for sedatives, and marked his paperwork. Unfit for frontline duty, recommend evacuation to rear. But in Bastogne, there was no such thing as evacuation. The Germans were pressing in from every direction. The 101st Airborne was surrounded in the snow-choked town, and every road lay under artillery coverage. So Carter had been parked at Regimental HQ as an awkward presence, neither the kind of wounded who were missing limbs, nor a whole soldier. He was a mental casualty, a man who needed watching and was at the same time instinctively avoided, a living sign of how war could quietly chew away the most basic human functions. They gave him chores that did not require fine control, carrying ammunition boxes that were not too heavy, handing out hot soup, sometimes running non-classified papers from one man to another. The others were polite and distant. The politeness carried pity. The distance held a faint unease, as if his shaking were a disease that might spread. The mood in the cellar was heavier than the temperature, not because of cold, but because of the dead air on the radio channels and the set of coordinates on the map, circled again and again, as if they could be forced back into existence by pencil pressure alone. F Company's position. It was a key forward spur of high ground, a nail driven into what might be a German supply line. Division's counterattack plan, a dawn strike meant to punch through the thickness of the encirclement, depended in large part on F Company launching a precisely timed flank hit, but contact had been gone for more than 36 hours. The last field telephone line had been shattered by shell fire 2 days earlier. After that, 3 two-man runner teams had been sent out, and all 3 had vanished like snowflakes into the black. Everyone knew what that meant. Under German patrols and sniper lines of sight, the route to F Company had become a long, narrow graveyard that swallowed men whole. 7th request for air support, the radio operator said, voice dry as if his vocal cords had frozen. Same answer, weather prevents sorties. Major Hammer, the intelligence officer, stabbed the map at F Company's position with a red pencil until the paper nearly tore. Without current aerial photos, we can't even draw their exact perimeter. And in the last supply drop, that damned map case fell into German lines. Lieutenant Colonel Cole, his face cut into deep channels by cold and anxiety, leaned over the rough wooden table, both hands planted, knuckles white. His gaze swept across everyone in the cellar, staff officers, clerks, runners, anyone still upright. Think again, he rasped. There was no rage in it, only exhaustion packed down to the limit. Who knows that route? Any detail, any possible trail, gully, rabbit hole. We need someone who can get through. Someone has to get through. The only answer was the wind howling outside the cellar door and the soft hiss of radio static. Men lowered their eyes. Men stared at the mapped death zone with hollow faces. The runners had not come back. That told them everything. This was not a question of courage. It was a question of probability. It was a suicide draw. Despair crept through the room like damp cold crawling up spines. Then a voice rose from the corner, small, unsteady, nearly stuttering. In the absolute silence, it sounded harsh, almost obscene. Sir. Everyone, including Colonel Cole, turned. The eyes in the room converged on Private Carter, curled up against the wall. He was pale. Under the weight of attention, his body seemed to shake harder, but he forced his head up to meet the Colonel's stare. But before I broke... Carter swallowed, trying to steady his voice. The last perimeter recon, I was on that team. We went out toward F Company's area. We came back, and the next day the barrage hit. The room held still for a beat. Major Hammer frowned. You're saying you know the way? Carter nodded stiffly. I kept it. Habit. I used to study surveying. Landmarks, turns, cover points. It's in my head. He lifted his trembling hands as if to gesture, then lowered them, defeated. His voice dropped. But now my hands, I might... He did not finish, but no one needed him to. A man who could not hold a broom steady, a man tormented by shrieking in his skull, was not a natural choice to cross a sealed killing ground. Doubt and a dangerous spark of desperation collided in the air. Major Hammer stepped quickly in front of Carter and looked into his eyes. Can you draw it? Mark the route on the map. Carter stared at his own fingers, fingers that jumped and quivered as if they belonged to someone else. He shook his head in despair. I can't hold a pencil. I can't draw a straight line. Then talk, Hammer said. Tell us. We'll draw. Carter closed his eyes as if he were fighting the noise inside his head. After a few seconds, he opened them again. There was something strange in his focus. Something that did not match the trembling body. From the west side of Regimental HQ, through the gap by the 3rd broken fence post, go straight 200 yards to the first stand of spruce. Inside, 3 shattered trunks lie down in a triangle. Crawl under the eastern one. 30 yards ahead is an anti-tank ditch. The middle section is partly filled with mud. You can cross fast there. Watch the left high point near the ruins. There may be an observation post. He started slow, then faster, spilling precise detail with an accuracy that startled the room. It did not sound like remembering. It sounded like reciting a 3-dimensional map burned into the inside of his skull. Major Hammer's eyes lit, then dimmed under the weight of what the detail implied. He turned to the colonel. He has it. It matches pieces we've gathered before, but he glanced at Carter's shaking frame. Colonel Cole stepped closer, his gaze like a searchlight on Carter's face. He looked for fear, hesitation, anything that read as false. Private Carter, Cole said, low and direct. The map in your head may be the only lifeline we have for over 100 men in F Company and for the timing of tomorrow's dawn strike. But you, in your condition, can you walk that route? I want the truth, not a soldier's answer to an officer. One man to another. Carter felt the air in the cellar press down on his chest. The ringing in his ears swelled until it seemed ready to split his drums. For a flash, he was back in the barrage, the stink of earth, the numb wave of blast through his body, the endless terror. He wanted to crawl back into the corner, clamp his hands over his head, make it stop. But at the same time, the landmarks in his mind were painfully clear. Shell holes, low ground, the short wall of an abandoned farmstead, like signposts in a black corridor. He remembered the last time he had been near F Company, the faces of young men in muddy foxholes waving at him, grinning. Were they still there? Still waiting for orders that would never come? He opened his mouth. His voice came out dry, like gravel. I'm scared, sir. I can't control this. He lifted his trembling hands. But I remember the route, every step. If no one else can go, I think I can try. I just need to follow the points I remember and keep moving. Seconds dragged. Cole and Hammer exchanged a look that held no inspirational glow, only a hard, almost cruel calculation. Finally, Cole nodded, not as a reward for courage, but as acceptance of the fact that there was no other move. Hammer, prepare the instruction, minimal format, seal it. Cole looked back at Carter, expression tangled. Private Carter, this isn't a citation. It's a line between life and death. Your job is to carry the instruction to F Company's commander, place it in his hands, and personally confirm he receives it and repeats the verification code. Then do everything you can to get back alive. You don't have to fight, you only have to reach them and return. The map in your head is the only nerve connecting us to them. Do you understand? Carter's knees threatened to buckle, but he straightened his spine, trying to make the shaking less obvious. He met the colonel's stare and nodded, the words squeezed out of his throat. Yes, sir. That was how the mission landed on the shoulders of a man nearly crushed by war, not because he was brave, but because he was the last one left who remembered the way. In the cellar, men moved at once, preparing a waterproof metal tube with the attack time and signal frequency and the code Carter would have to deliver by mouth. Carter stood still, feeling the future weight of the tube in his hand and the clearer, heavier weight of the rote in his mind. The tremor remained, so did the fear. But beneath them, something older and more stubborn, maybe a surveyor's obsession with accuracy, maybe the simple refusal to let those faces in F Company disappear, began to pulse, faint but persistent. The journey had not started, but the first and hardest step was already done. He had spoken up, admitted he remembered, and accepted the cold, singular task. The tube was not heavy. In Carter's trembling hand, it felt like a block of ice, dense and hungry, clinging to the last warmth in his palm. Its body was cold, the rough waterproof thread scraping his skin. Inside lay a rolled slip of paper with only a few words, a time, a signal frequency, and the verification code he would have to speak face to face to F Company's captain. A meaningless string of letters and numbers, the only proof the instruction was real. No complicated plan, no speeches, only the simplest, deadliest information. When Major Hammer handed it over, his lips were white and tight. In the end, he said only, "Don't lose it, don't open it, deliver it, confirm it, come back. Those are the only three things." The cellar door cracked open. Grey daylight and sharper wind pushed inside. There was no send-off, no hand on the shoulder. Carter was simply a vessel of memory shoved forward by necessity. His first steps sank into snow up to his ankles. Cold punched through the thin boots at once. He shuddered, not only from temperature. In the short strip of relative safety outside the hidden HQ, the edge of no man's land lay about 50 yards ahead, ground greeted by stray rounds and the occasional mortar as a matter of routine. Carter followed the first instruction in his mind, lower his center of gravity, nearly crouch, scan with his eyes, not for enemies, but for the first navigation point. The third broken fence post on the west side. He saw it, a leaning stake showing a black crooked stub above the snow. He drew a breath of air that tasted of cold and the stale residue of gunpowder and forced his legs into motion. The shaking had not stopped, but something more mechanical, more ruthless, pressed down on it. His mind did not hold the grand idea of reach F Company. It held only the next landmark. Like surveying class, where you did not draw the whole map at once, you connected one measured point to the next. Crossing the initial open stretch was agony. Wind whipped snow into the air. Visibility came and went. Every time a shot cracked somewhere distant, sniper probing, stray fire, he could not tell. His muscles locked tight and the ringing in his ears surged as if it would spear through his skull. His heart hammered in the cage of his chest. His throat dried. Fear was not an emotion. It was a physical thing. It sat on his back and closed a hand around his throat. He wanted to drop flat, to crawl back to the cellar corner where he had been humiliated but alive. His fingers tightened around the metal tube. Its cold was shockingly real. And his mind produced the next instruction without mercy. "Go straight 200 yards to the first spruce stand." He began counting his steps. He dragged through snow, eyes fixed on the dark outline of trees in the white haze. His world shrank into footfalls, into breath, into the steady update of coordinates inside his skull. Inside the spruce, the light fell away. The wind became a muffled moan trapped in needles and boughs. It was more concealed, but the silence was worse. Carter leaned against a trunk, gasping, white vapor billowing from his mouth. He closed his eyes and tried to shut out the shriek in his ears, long enough to recall. 3 shattered trunks lying in a triangle. He opened his eyes, searched and found them to his left front. Torn by shell fire, half buried in snow, they formed a crooked geometry. Crawl under the eastern one. Carter dropped to his belly, pressed his chest to ice-cold snow and began to worm forward. The trembling grew stronger against the ground. Elbows and knees slipped in wet snow and mud. Rotting pine needles and icy water soaked into the front of his coat. A snapped branch scraped his back as he squeezed under the low gap, pain flaring sharp and brief. He made it through, like completing one more step in a preset procedure. After that, time stopped behaving like time. Hours broke into segments divided by remembered points. the anti-tank ditch, the half-collapsed farm wall, a frozen creek. Each landmark, when it appeared, was a small lighthouse in a featureless dark, proof he had not drifted off the route that existed only in his mind. Sometimes he sprinted across a shallow basin with no cover, sometimes he stayed motionless for long stretches in the shadow of a ruin, listening, watching. Once he heard German voices far off, patrol talk across a frozen drainage. He pressed himself to a stone wall, held his breath until the noise faded. Only then did he realize his jaw ached from clenching, and the tube in his hand had become slick with sweat, even in the cold, made worse by the shaking. He was not performing some refined art of stealth. He was reproducing, with stubborn precision, the path his reconnaissance team had taken before he broke. He avoided the areas he had already flagged as dangerous on that earlier walk. Memory became his guide dog through a maze of death. But memory could not predict every variable. He was moving along what should have been a dry creek bed choked with brush, using it as a covered bypass when the world shifted. From around the bend ahead came clear non-English speech and the crunch of boots on ice crust. A German patrol, not distant, close, moving toward him. In an instant, terror struck like ice water to the face. Blood surged to his head and then seemed to freeze. The ringing in his ears became a roar. He thought, run! His legs felt filled with lead. He thought, hide! The creek bed had shallow slopes on both sides, bare and exposed, and the nearest thick brush lay 20 yards away. Any movement now would be seen. He could hear his own heart, loud enough to betray him. Then his eyes snapped to the creek bed itself, and a detail in his mind flashed like lightning. Winter Creek, partly frozen, but in the middle where there's a spring, the ice is thin, water running underneath. And there, 5 steps away, the ice was darker, almost black-blue, the color of weakness. Beside it were slumped chunks of earth and wet stones exposed through the crust. There was no time to weigh options. The boots and voices were closing. Carter lunged, not toward the bank, but onto the dark ice. He drove his weight and his elbow down at the edge. Crack! Ice shattered with a sound that made his teeth hurt. Freezing water surged up at once, soaking his arm and chest. He did not have time to feel how cold it was. He tore at the broken ice, forced his body into the hole, curled into the small hollow at the water's edge, then dragged over larger slabs of floating ice and dead grass from the bank, covering his head and face as best he could. The water rose to his chest. Cold stabbed him with 1,000 needles. His breath locked. His teeth clattered uncontrollably. He buried his face in his soaked sleeve and tried to make himself smaller than a shadow. Boots stopped on the bank above his head. German voices were sharp in the frozen air, tired and watchful, the way frontline speech always was. A flashlight beam swept the ice. It passed over the rim of his hiding place, trembled, moved on. Carter kept his eyes shut and poured everything he had into enduring the cold and the sound. Seconds crawled like years. Cold began to steal feeling from his limbs. A familiar fatigue rose, seductive and dangerous. Sleep here. Let it end. Too cold, too tired. The thought came with a sick sweetness, but the tube in his clothing, hard metal against his chest, even through the wet fabric, was there, present, heavy with purpose. F Company, those faces, the colonel's rasp, the only nerve, his own quiet answer, I can try, no, not yet. He found a thread of strength from nowhere and curled tighter, fighting numbness and the pull of sleep. He forced his mind away from the water and back to the next landmark, a picture not belonging to this moment. After this creek valley, there would be a burned-out ammunition truck, then a right turn up a slope. He made himself imagine the wreck, the angle of the climb, what came after. He anchored the disappearing present with an insistence on what came next. At last, the boots moved again, crunching away, fading into wind and snow. Carter waited longer, then used arms that barely listened to him to push aside ice and grass. Inch by inch, he hauled himself out. He collapsed onto the bank, soaked through, shaking harder than he ever had. Every breath hurt his lungs. His throat threatened to break with a sob he could not afford. But he was alive. The tube was still there. The route was still in his head. He had not beaten the patrol. He had used a remembered detail of terrain, made the only possible choice, and then endured it. He stood, a wet, trembling man in a white world, and moved on. The rest of the march blurred into a half-mechanical grind. Cold and exhaustion drained him. The tremor was violent now, but the navigation in his mind ran stubbornly. Landmark after landmark appearing, recognized, then left behind. When he finally saw the edge of familiar American fighting holes on the rise ahead, frozen earth and timber, and a dirt-smeared flag barely visible, he felt no surge of victory, only a hollow, dizzy fatigue and a question that would not shut up. Did I really make it, or is this another trick of the mind? A hoarse voice called from behind sandbags. "Halt! Password!" Carter stopped, swayed. He blinked snow water from his eyes and stared at the soldier aiming a rifle at him, a man with frostbite marks on his face, and the exhausted stare of someone who had lived too long in a hole. Carter opened his mouth. His lips were cracked enough to bleed. He raised the hand holding the tube, a hand that could barely keep it. Not the password, he forced out. "Find Captain Hawk. Regimental message. Carter, private." Voices rose in alarm. Hands grabbed him, hauled him down into the trench line. The tube went from his trembling hand to another. The instruction reached safety. The verification code was repeated back. The mission's core was complete. For Carter, it was not an ending. A part of him knew he still had to return. The route his memory had lit. He would have to walk it again, backward, carrying a different weight. Not the goal of delivery, but the promise of coming back. He left F Company's position and stepped into wind and snow again. The return felt longer, colder. He followed the same landmarks in reverse. He moved slowly, avoiding danger, but his mind drifted in and out, exhaustion pulling him under. Only when the broken fence and the alert faces of the HQ sentries came into view did he allow the taut wire inside him to slacken. He did not report. He did not salute. He stumbled forward and fell into the arms reaching for him. The metal tube in his hand was empty. He had done it. He was back. The first thing to return was sound. Not the leftover shriek of shell fire, but a low, steady hum broken by hushed voices and the soft clink of metal utensils. Then came touch, the coarse wool blanket beneath him, heavy and not quite warm, the deep, bone-level ache in his joints and chest, especially where the ice water had seeped into him, and the familiar shaking, smaller now but still there. Carter opened his eyes. Above him was the yellowed canvas roof of a medical tent. A kerosene lamp threw unsteady light from a central table. The air smelled of disinfectant, blood, and wet wool, layered into something sour and permanent. A medic leaned over him, blocking some of the light. "You're awake! How you feeling, Private?" Carter tried to speak. His throat hurt and only a breathy sound came out. He managed a small nod. "You were badly hypothermic, dehydrated, and you ran your body clean out of fuel. No serious external wounds." The medic listened to his chest with a stethoscope. "F Company says you showed up like a ghost, delivered the instruction, confirmed it, didn't even drink water, and tried to head right back out. You're either lucky or that map in your head is damn near perfect." The medic did not sound impressed or awed. He sounded like a man stating an observed fact. "Stay down. The colonel said the moment you wake up, we notify him." Notify the colonel. The thought tightened something in Carter. The mission was complete, but he did not know what came next. Reprimand for risk? Routine debrief because he was the messenger who returned? He closed his eyes, tried to assemble his thoughts, but his mind held only broken images. Ice shattering with a hard crack, the tube pressing into his chest, the bloodshot eyes in F Company lighting up as the instruction arrived, the endless reverse march home. Not long after, the tent flap opened and cold air spilled in. Heavy boots thumped on the boards. Lieutenant Colonel Cole and Major Hammer stepped inside, bringing the outside chill with them. The medic snapped a salute and moved aside. Cole walked to the field cot and looked down at Carter. His expression was still grave, but something in his bloodshot eyes had loosened by a fraction. "Private Carter," he said, quiet, still hoarse. Carter tried to sit up to salute, but his arms could not lift his own weight. Cole pressed a hand to his shoulder, not gently. Stay down. The hand did not lift away. It closed on Carter's shaking shoulder and squeezed. Hard, real. Not a comforting pat so much as a physical confirmation that this trembling body was here, had returned, had accomplished the nearly impossible. The grip held for 2 or 3 seconds, then released. Captain Hawk transmitted the verification code using their last battery power. They got the instruction. The dawn action will go as planned. Cole kept it bare and direct. What you carried may have saved a lot of lives, or at least kept a lot of us from dying tomorrow morning. His eyes dropped to Carter's hands. Your mission is complete, Private. You did it well. No hero, no flourish, only you did it well. Coming from Colonel Cole, the words had a weight that fancy praise could not. They meant the system had accepted the result. The gear had turned. Carter felt a weak warmth that did not come from his body, a small release, and then exhaustion rolled over it like a tide. Major Hammer stepped up with a notebook and pencil. Carter, you're not done yet. We need what's in your head. His tone was pure business. The route you walked. Every landmark, turn, hiding point, danger area. How long each stretch took. Any pattern you noticed. German patrol frequency, likely positions. All of it. We need it recorded right now while it's fresh. You talk, I write. So under the kerosene lamp's wavering light, Carter began to speak. At first his words came in broken bursts, interrupted by coughing, but once he slipped into describing terrain, that same strange focus returned. He was no longer only a shaking patient, he was a provider of professional information. Major Hammer wrote fast, pausing only to press for detail. That fill-in on the anti-tank ditch, wide enough for one man at speed. Yes. The thin ice spot, besides the one you used, any others within 10 yards, Carter answered as precisely as he could. The process lasted nearly an hour. His voice grew weaker, but the structure of what he offered became more systematic. The private map that had been his alone was being transcribed and converted into something public, something usable. When he finally reached the last point, the gap by the broken fence post at Regimental HQ, Hammer shut the notebook and let out a long breath. That's going to save more runners, Carter. I'm speaking for headquarters when I say thank you. This time the gratitude was for his competence as a source, for the hard utility of his memory. Over the next several days, Carter stayed in the medical tent receiving basic care and observation. The shaking and the ringing did not vanish. The surgeon still believed he needed evacuation for specialized treatment. Once the encirclement broke and a corridor opened, he would be near the top of the list. But until then, he was no longer the idle errand man or the pure burden. The change was small but definite. Sometimes when staff officers argued over a platoon's movement route or how to place fire points, someone would suddenly say, "Wait, ask Carter." In his last report, he mentioned a stump field east of that low ground. Could give side cover. A young lieutenant would run to the medical tent, kneel by Carter's cot with a rough sketch in hand. Private Carter, about the third segment of the Carter route, the abandoned farmhouse you mentioned. Is the stone wall still sound? Could it take a near miss from a mortar? Carter would close his eyes and summon the image, then answer. The southeast corner is down, but the west wall's mostly intact stone foundation. No roof, though. From above or from high ground, there's no cover. He became a specialized node in the HQ's network. His value was not that he could shoulder a rifle and charge. It was not that he could hold a pencil and draw clean lines. It was the singular, verified experience of walking through the ring and back, and the surveyor's near-obsessive memory for terrain detail. It was respect built out of extreme pragmatism. No one called him a hero, but the phrase "the Carter route" began to circulate in a tight radius. The guide built from his description was copied a few times and passed to small teams who might have to attempt similar runs. Carter sometimes heard men outside the tent speak in lowered voices as they passed. That the one they called the living map? Yeah, they say his head's got the whole perimeter's hell paths in it. One afternoon, Colonel Cole came again, not alone. A communications officer from division accompanied him. They discussed the possibility of establishing emergency observation posts behind German lines. The officer tapped a patch of thick woods on the map. We're blind here. Air recon's grounded by weather and German flak. Cole studied it, then turned to Carter on the cot. Carter, when you walked that route, did you notice this area? He pointed to a coordinate. Is there any possibility of an infiltration path not under direct fire coverage? Any impression helps. Carter tried to pull the memory up. That wood line lay on the edge of his mental map. He remembered standing on a slight rise, looking back, seeing a pattern of birds lifting in a peculiar formation, and a faint line that might have been an old logging track. He could not be sure. He told them what he had cautiously. Birds might mean an open patch or water. A logging track might mean firmer ground underfoot. He made clear it was impression, not certainty. The communications officer wrote it down anyway. Cole nodded once. That's enough. It's better than guessing blind. When they left, the tent fell quiet again. Carter stared at the canvas roof, listening to distant artillery. The dawn counterattack had come and gone, and fighting still raged around Bastogne. But the Germans had not crushed the pocket. Slowly, he raised his still trembling hand and held it in front of his face. The shaking remained. The fear remained. The string inside him, the barrage had loosened, did not feel fully reset. He was still laying Carter, a private troubled by shell shock, but something had shifted. He no longer had to curl in a corner and hide his hands. Those hands could not draw straight lines and could not hold a rifle steady, but they had gripped a metal tube and carried it across a death zone. The landmarks in his mind, the details that had once been only a professional habit, had been tested, recorded, needed. He felt like a precise instrument that had survived by accident, its casing cracked, its needle unsteady, but the data stored inside it had been read when the system was close to failure and used to correct actions that decided who lived. He had not become the shining hero of a war story. He was an emergency interface discovered when all regular lines had broken. His value lay in his uniqueness and his irreplaceability, and those things came directly from his trauma and from the way his condition had pushed him to the margins. War chewed individuals down without mercy, but sometimes, under absolute pressure, it was forced to recognize and exploit traits it would otherwise discard as useless. Carter had found a new place, a living terrain database, a beacon, not a triumphant lighthouse pointing to victory, but a single stubborn light in a black snow-filled night of broken communications, marking the exact coordinates of a lethal channel through the dark. Artillery still sounded far away, dull and heavy. Wind tugged at the tent ropes with a low moan. Carter lowered his hand and closed it gently into a fist, feeling the tremor and also feeling something deeper, an odd, steady calm. The mission was done. The route was still etched in his mind. He closed his eyes this time not to hide, but to let the landmarks float up again in silence, connect, and form a map that belonged to him alone, silent, reliable, and real.